Okay, chapter 5, day 6. Day 5 we quizzed, so this will be day 6 video. Today what we're going to focus on is what are complex numbers. So that's new for you. It's new. It's okay. And how do we use them? How do we use complex numbers? So the first thing we need to do is define what a complex number is. A complex number actually has two parts to it. The complex number is written A plus B, and that's an I. All right, it looks like an I with a tail. Okay, A plus BI. Well, the real part is the number we've always worked with. But now what's new to us is we have this extra piece that's called the imaginary part. All right, so a complex number has a real part, looks like numbers like we've always been used to, and then this imaginary part that has some number times I. All right, so that's what a complex number is. Let's figure out what this I thing is then. So remember how I always said we can't take the square root of a negative number? Well, we can't take the square root of a negative number and get a real number, but we can take the square root of a negative number now and we'll get an imaginary number. So the square root of -1 is the letter I. So if it says simplify the square root of -16, what we do is we break it down. We have the square root of -1 times the square root of 16. The square root of -1 is I. The square root of 16 is 4. And we write this as 4I. We like to put the whole number out front, then the I, and then if there's a radical left over, we'll write that after it. So we don't really have to show this too much after the first one, because as long as you can see that square root of 16 is 4, negative is always going to give me an I, you don't really have to show that you pulled out the square root of -1. Just know that if negative is in here, I can pull it out as an I. Let's see what if it's like square root of 20. -20, if it doesn't have a perfect square. Well, I know that square root of 20 is square root of 4, square root of 5, and I have an I left out because of the negative. So this is going to be 2. I always put the I next before the square root. 2I radical 5. And that's your answer. So negative gives us the I. 20 is like old times. All right? So let's look at now the powers of I. Like what if we raise I to a power? Okay? So I to the first, well, anything to the first power is itself. I squared, well, if we think about it, that's going to be the square root of -1 times the square root of -1. And the square root of anything times the square root of anything is the anything. This one's really important that you remember. Really important. Because that's going to occur a lot as we go through this I stuff. I squared is -1. It's really important that you remember that. I squared has a value of -1. Super important. I to the third, well, if you remember about rules for powers, that's I squared times I to the first. I squared times I to the first is just, we know that this is -1. We know that this is I, and a -1 times I is -I. I to the fourth, well, that would be I squared times I squared. -1 times -1 is +1. Also, I to the 0 is also 1. Anything to the 0 power is 1. All right, so those are some initial powers of I. And so where are we going with this? Well, let's take a look at some higher powers. All right, I to the 5th. Can I write that as I to the 4th times I to the 1st? Well, I to the 4th is 1 times I to the 1st is I, so I to the 5th is I. I to the 6th, that's I to the 4th times 2. I to the 7th, I to the 4th times 3. I to the 8th, I to the 4th times I to the 4th. Notice all of these are I to the 4th times something. And this is I to the 1st, I to the 2nd, I to the 3rd, I to the 4th. So what happens is this just repeats itself. Notice, it goes I, -1, -I, 1. I to the 5th is I to the 6th, negative 1, because it's 1 times I squared. I to the 7th, 1 times I to the 3rd. I to the 8th, 1 times 1. I, negative 1, negative I, 1. If I did I to the 9th, it would be I, then I to the 10th would be 1, negative I, 1. It's just a repeating cycle. Sometimes people write it as a circle. I just, it just keeps going. I, negative 1, negative I, 1. So if I want to do I to the 23rd power, I could either keep counting, I could count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. My answer should be negative I. I could just count it as long as I know these basic 4 things. I, negative 1, negative I, 1. I could actually just count it. So the answer should be negative I. Well, if you notice, it's cyclical every 4. So what we're going to do is we're going to divide 23 by 4. And 4 goes into 23. Well, 5 times 4 is 20 with a remainder of 3. Remainder is 3. Well, that means I went through this thing 5 times and a remainder of 3. 1, 2, 3 should put me right here at negative I. And so what happens is to solve this, remainder is 3, so that transfers itself to I to the 3rd, which we know is negative I. And you're just going to have to memorize the fact that I to the 3rd is negative I. I, negative 1, negative I, 1. And if you don't memorize it, just walk back through how we did it. I to the 1st is itself. I squared, negative 1. I to the 3rd is I squared times I to the 1st, which is negative I. I to the 4th, I squared times I squared, which is 1. And you can get through any one of these problems. Let's try I to the 16th. Well, I'm going to take 16 divided by 4. It goes in evenly with a remainder of 0. Well, that would be I to the 0, which I know anything to the 0 is 1. So let's look. I to the 16th, let's see if it matches, if I would just count on my hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. My answer should be 1. Most of the ones they give you, if you set this up, you can just count the whole time. And it's fine. You can count through numbers pretty quickly. All right? So that's the powers of I. And the last thing we're going to look at is then, how do we take these complex numbers and add them together? All right? Well, you're going to add the like parts, just like we did with radicals, and just like we do with variables. You're going to add like terms or like parts. So I'm taking 3 plus 4i plus 5 minus 2i. Well, the 3 and the 5 are like parts. That's an 8. Plus 4 take away 2 is 2i. And that's your answer. You're adding like terms. Just add the things that are alike. All right? I can add like things here. Square root of negative 4. Well, square root of 4 is 2. The negative gives me an I. Square root of 9 is 3. The negative gives me an I. 2i plus 3i, that's 5i. All right, if it's not simplifiable right away, we can still break it down. Square root of 4, square root of 2 with an I. 25 and 2. Square root of 25, square root of 2 with an I. So I have 2i radical 2. Again, the I will come outside of the radical. 5i radical 2. Well, if I have 2 of these plus 5 of these, that gives me 7 of those, and that's how you simplify that. Last thing, we can simplify adding powers of I. I to the squared, I squared we know is negative 1. I to the 3rd is negative I to the 7th. Okay, so we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's the same as I to the 3rd, which is negative I. So I got -1, negative I, and another negative I is a negative 2I. So we're going to practice this in class, working with powers of I, and working with simplifying, adding I stuff together. Okay?